You can really tell the technologist from the not-so-technologist based on who's looking down at their phone on Twitter right now. All right. I'm going to talk about data-driven education. I don't like podiums either. I didn't like bright lights. I'm normally a drummer, so I'm at the back beyond the lights. No one can never see me, and I'm cool with that. So I work for Urban Strategies Council based out of Oakland, California. We are a social impact organization. We've been around for 25 years. We're founded by Angela Glover Blackwell. We're a social impact organization that focuses on a whole variety of things, from community benefits to social innovation to crime reentry, community planning, engagement. We do a lot. I'm on a timer. My research team focuses on data-driven decision-making in government and in the public sector and nonprofits. We do democratization of data by getting data out of government, out of our shops, into other hands. Data for action, not data for academic research, for reports, data to make a change. California, beautiful state, amazing state. I moved here 7 years ago. Number 1 in education 20, 30 years ago. Number 47, number 48 right now in the state. That's pretty sad for a state which has so much to offer, has Silicon Valley just down the road. Now, when education outcomes are bad, we have to ask the questions, who gets failed the most by this system? In America, in Oakland, African-American males. Nationally, 4 out of 10 African-American males graduate, 8 out of 10 white males will graduate. In Oakland, if you're a white male born in the hills, you'll live 15 years longer than a black male born in the flatlands. So the school district, awesome superintendent, started a new initiative called African-American Male Achievement, focusing on these 7 indicators of change and equity. Unfortunately, he came up with them before he came up with the data, which had some issues. First one was suspension. When we started to look at the disparities in outcomes for African-American males compared to the general population, we started to see 6 times the rate of suspensions for African-American males. If you're not in school, you're not going to learn. So that's obviously a huge issue for us to start to dig into. When we started looking at why is obviously important, right? We started to see that this one particular type of offense was responsible for a huge amount of African-American male suspension, and it's a hugely subjective measure, defiance, willful defiance and disruption. That's a very subjective thing. To try and put this in perspective, for the Oakland Unified School District, 6,000 days of school are lost amongst the African-American male population for suspension each year. So that's a huge amount of time not in school, and obviously if you're not in school, you're not going to be on the track to graduate. From our research and from our project, we had a big success this year. One of the biggest pieces that came out of it was policy recommendations around defiance as a suspension reason in the state. Jerry Brown just signed off this last week saying that this law was in place now. You couldn't use that reason in the same context for suspension. So getting into another issue we looked at was chronic absenteeism, missing more than 10% of the school year. ADA is used in California, average daily attendance, and it masks the reality of chronic absenteeism. So this is a general whitewashing number that hides a lot of the nuance that really matters if you've got a lot of kids out a lot. Again, this was a measure that we showed a huge amount of disparity between African-American males and the rest of the population of the district. About 1 in 4 African-American males were chronically absent across a school year, and this is like the leading indicator for suspension and graduation and success in later life. When we started to look at the whys, it's not something that's easy to deal with because it changes by where you are in your life. In elementary school, the main reason was the average number of days ill was the biggest predictor of absenteeism. In high school, it was unverified. There's no reason why. And so, big deal, what's new? We all know that kids don't go to school, right? Except we don't really know that. We didn't have any good data being used by the principals. We didn't have any ideas coming out of teachers around how to deal with that. And there was no action that could happen because no one really had the data in a usable format. So this project, we came out of a lot of interesting angles. Real-time data tracking is essential for this, so teachers intervene in real time. Otherwise, we've lost the opportunity. We need to have better ways to engage with families as well. And one of the big problems that came out of this was that there's a disconnect in who we hire in government. We have analysts that can crunch numbers. We don't have analysts that can communicate the issues to people, and the data sits in a silo in a file cabinet, and no one ever has access to the data. And without access to that, you can't make informed decisions. A real quick one. On the left is on-track students. On the right is off-track students with food stamps as a measure for poverty behind it. When we looked at this geographically, we started to see these interesting trends where it wasn't just school-based data, the neighborhood-based data actually looked differently. So for us, this was a challenge around how can we communicate to a broader audience the variations that happen at a school and a neighborhood level. And so when we built infoalaminacounty.org a couple of years ago, we built in tools to allow people to look at the enrollment zones, which is open in Oakland, and to be able to compare it with other things. So you can say, well, I'm really curious about root causes and what's happening in my city. I want to start to look at where the chronic absenteeism is across the city in the red chloropleth map, the green, and then the red I can look at foreclosures and start to see what are things that are actually correlated and building as far as the inequity in my community. So last of all, some of the context here is important. So education is sort of, for us, is the root cause of a lot of our good outcomes or bad. If we don't have a good education system, you aren't going to get the jobs that are available. And if there aren't any jobs available, you can't build assets and grow. So these things all matter. And ultimately why the education factors need to change in this country, why there needs to be equity, is that we really all want our kids to be able to go to a great public school, get a great education, and to succeed so they can turn around and get married in their school cafeteria if they so choose to. We want our kids to have equity, we want our kids to have great, just education, and it needs to be a fair system, and data can really help illuminate and educate, inform, and lead to policy change that really impacts lives. I'm over, but one thing I missed when I did my deck last week, I was actually on time, was just last Friday, the school board approved a unanimous vote for the voluntary reduction plan, which is an Office of Civil Rights investigation into suspension in Oakland, which came out of the research work that we did illuminating these disparities. So we've now seen the White House and the federal government step in and say, this has to change, you cannot be doing this, these disparities cannot exist. And so for us, it's a really amazing example of how something that may have had an impact or may have not has led to some huge change in our school system, and the school board is on board with that as well and excited about how this data, these issues can actually be changed. Because if we raise the boat for the lowest performing group in the district, we really raise the outcomes overall, and we'll see the data look better across the board. So thank you for your time.